They thought the old man was losing his mind, that I would just sign the papers without reading the fine print and hand over everything Helen and I had built our entire lives. They saw me as a relic, an old calculator in the age of artificial intelligence. They forgot who I was for 40 years. I am an auditor. I don't see numbers. I see the lies hidden between them, and I have prepared my own final balance sheet for them. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. The house had grown too quiet after Helen's death. The silence was not merely an absence of sound. It had weight and texture. It was dense, like the morning fog over a river, settling on the old furniture, seeping into the cracks of the hardwood floors, and filling the closets that still held her dresses. I had lived in this house for 48 years, and for the first time, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a vast, echoing mausoleum where I served as the sole, final curator. My name is Walter Blackwood. I am 74 years old, and I am a retired certified public accountant. For my entire professional life, I dealt with numbers, with balance sheets, with the immutable laws of debit and credit. Numbers do not lie. They form neat, logical systems where every unit has its place, and the final sum always reflects the truth. I tried to apply that logic to my new life, but it refused to compute. Grief could not be quantified, and loneliness could not be written off. My days had become a meticulously structured ritual, the only defense I had against the chaos of sorrow. I would rise at 6 in the morning, not a minute sooner or later. Coffee was made in the old drip machine that Helen had wanted to throw out a decade ago, but which I had insisted we keep. I measured exactly 3 scoops of the coffee grounds, her recipe. The sound of the water gurgling through the filter was one of the few predictable and comforting sounds in my day. With my mug in hand, I would sit at the kitchen table, in the very same seat I had occupied every morning for decades. The maple tabletop was worn smooth beneath my elbows, the wood in that spot darker and glossier than the rest. It was a physical record of time, of a life lived together. I would stare out the window at the backyard, at the bird feeder Helen had asked me to hang. I continued to fill it with seeds every week, though the joy of watching the bustling finches and sparrows had faded. I did it because it was part of the established order of things. Everything in the house remained in its place, just as her hand had last arranged it. I had become the keeper of her world. The porcelain figurines of a shepherdess and a chimney sweep on the mantelpiece, which we had bought at a flea market on our honeymoon. The stack of gardening magazines on the coffee table, as if she had just set them down to go water her roses. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, next to a novel she would never finish. Sometimes, walking past, I would find myself adjusting them, nudging them a fraction of an inch to make them perfectly straight. Any change felt like a betrayal, a disruption of a sacred balance. My son, Michael, would look around with concern during his visits, seeing this world frozen in time. He would gently suggest that perhaps it was time to clear some things out, to donate them to charity. He didn't understand. These weren't just things. They were line items in the great ledger of my life. They were proof that Helen was here, that we had built all of this together, cent by cent, day by day. But time, the most ruthless of all auditors, was relentlessly closing its accounts. My own body had begun to send notices I could no longer ignore. My blood pressure would rise for no reason. The staircase to the second floor seemed to grow longer each month. My doctor, at my last physical, spoke of the need to reduce stress and look toward the future. The lawyer I used for my property taxes tactfully but persistently reminded me of the importance of putting my affairs in order. I knew what they meant: a will, powers of attorney, trusts. Words that had been mere professional terms my whole life now took on a grim, personal weight. They were talking about the final transaction of my life, the closing of my accounts. I, Walter Blackwood, a man who had conducted thousands of audits for other people's companies, who could find a 1/10% discrepancy in a 1,000,000-page report, was terrified to begin my own final accounting, because to do so meant admitting that the credit of my life was nearly exhausted. But my fear gave way to my duty. I had a son, Michael, my only heir. Everything Helen and I had built was for him and for my grandson, Josh. My solemn duty was to protect that legacy. I had to ensure that the final entry in my ledger was accurate, clear, and indisputable. My younger brother, Leo, had always been my opposite, a variable in an equation where I was a constant, where I saw the world as a ledger of assets and liabilities that needed to be meticulously balanced. He saw it as a grand casino of opportunity, a place of risks to be taken and charms to be deployed. I had built my career on the bedrock of caution and verifiable facts. He had built his on a shifting foundation of charisma and speculative ventures. Over the years, I had been the one to quietly balance his books, to reconcile his optimistic projections with harsh reality, providing the loans that served as the silent, unmentioned ballast to his unsteady ship. The dynamic was as old as our brotherhood itself. He was the salesman, and I was the auditor who checked his math. So when he called, his voice brimming with a practiced, earnest concern that sanded down the edges of my skepticism, I felt a wave of profound relief. The burden of organizing my estate, a task that felt like chiseling my own tombstone, was something I did not want to face alone. He suggested coming over, framing it not as an intrusion, but as a duty, a younger brother's simple desire to help. He said he had been thinking about me, alone in that big house, and that he had spoken to a friend who knew an excellent estate lawyer. This lawyer, he explained, specialized in family trusts and could make the whole process painless and efficient. The words painless and efficient were like a balm to my anxious mind. They were the language of my profession, suggesting order and a clean resolution. I agreed without hesitation. The thought of navigating the emotional and legal complexities with a stranger was daunting. Doing it with my brother, my own blood, seemed like the most natural thing in the world. He was still family, after all, and in the quiet calculus of my grief, the value of that bond felt immeasurably high. He arrived the following afternoon, and he did not come alone. My daughter-in-law, Amelia, was with him. Her presence was a surprise, but not an unwelcome one. She carried a warm apple pie, its cinnamon scent filling the sterile quiet of my kitchen and momentarily masking the smell of dust and disuse. Amelia had a way of bringing a flurry of life into a room. She moved with a quick, bird-like energy, straightening a picture frame on the wall, fluffing a cushion on the sofa, her actions a gentle but firm campaign against the static melancholy of the house. She fussed over me, telling me I was too thin, her touch on my arm both light and proprietary. She spoke of Michael and Josh, painting a picture of a happy, thriving family unit that I was still the patriarch of. It was a masterful performance, designed to reassure and disarm, and I, in my loneliness, was a willing audience. They sat with me at the dining room table, the same table where we had shared countless holiday meals, its polished surface now reflecting our somber faces. Leo, dressed in a suit that was just a little too sharp for a casual visit, spread out a series of pamphlets and brochures from the law firm. He spoke with the smooth, confident cadence of a man closing a deal. He used terms like asset protection, tax mitigation, and generational wealth transfer. He made it all sound like a strategic game, a final brilliant move to checkmate the government and secure the family's future. He presented it not as an end, but as a legacy. While he spoke, Amelia would nod in agreement, her eyes fixed on me with an expression of deep, sincere empathy. She would interject with soft, supportive comments, asking questions that showed she was listening intently, that she cared about the details. She refilled my coffee cup, remembered I took no sugar, and placed a slice of the warm pie in front of me. It was a perfectly synchronized effort, a duet of concern and competence. They made me feel not like a fading old man, but like a wise king planning the future of his dynasty, and they were my loyal counselors. In that moment, surrounded by their concerted attention, I allowed myself to trust. I delegated the most important task of my life to my charming brother and my caring daughter-in-law, believing they were acting only in the best interests of my son and of the memory of the woman who had helped me build everything I had. The humiliation did not arrive like a thunderstorm, loud and violent. It seeped in like a colorless, odorless gas, silent and lethal, in the climate-controlled stillness of a 40th floor law office. The meeting had been scheduled for a Tuesday. I had laid out my gray suit the night before, a suit I had not worn since Helen's funeral. The act of putting it on, of knotting the silk tie, felt like donning a suit of armor for a final, necessary battle. I felt a sense of purpose I had not known in months. The accounts were finally going to be put in order. Leo was supposed to pick me up, but he called just as I was polishing my shoes. His voice was a slick blend of apology and urgency, a last-minute crisis with an important client, a meeting he absolutely could not miss. He was terribly sorry. He told me the address, assured me the lawyer was expecting me, and said he and Amelia would meet me there as soon as they possibly could. There was no reason for me to suspect anything. The world of business, especially Leo's world, was full of such manufactured emergencies. I simply accepted it as a minor logistical inconvenience. The law firm occupied the top floors of a skyscraper downtown, a stark tower of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the clouds. The lobby was a cavern of marble and recessed lighting, and the air was cold and thin. It was a place designed to make a man feel small and insignificant, a single entry in a vast, indifferent ledger. I gave my name to the receptionist, a young woman who offered a smile that did not reach her eyes, and she directed me to a conference room. The room was aggressively modern. A long dark table polished to a mirror shine reflected the distorted city skyline. The chairs were monuments of leather and chrome, uncomfortable and cold. Abstract art, a chaotic splash of colors that gave me a headache, adorned the walls. It was the antithesis of my home, a space devoid of memory or warmth, and I felt my age acutely, a relic of wood and wool in an age of steel and glass. The receptionist brought me a glass of water and said that Mr. Davison was running a few minutes behind. I nodded and sat down to wait. The minutes stretched into an eternity. 10 minutes. 20. The only sound was the faint, electronic hum of the building's circulation system and the soft, maddeningly precise click of a minimalist clock on the wall. Each click was a small, sharp reminder of my own dwindling time. I watched the traffic moving on the streets far below, tiny metallic insects following their prescribed paths. I felt a growing sense of unease, a low-frequency anxiety that had nothing to do with the legal matters at hand. It was the feeling of being out of my element, of having ceded control. I, who had spent a lifetime commanding meetings, dictating terms, and verifying facts, was now sitting alone, waiting for others to decide my future. To combat the stiffness in my legs, I stood and walked to the panoramic window. It was from there, looking back at the long, empty table, that I noticed the door to the adjacent office. It was a smaller interior room, and the door was not fully closed. It was open by a mere inch. My actions were not driven by suspicion, but by the simple, idle curiosity of a man enduring a long wait. I drifted towards the door, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. I peered through the narrow opening. The office was empty, a desk cluttered with neat stacks of files. It was an accountant's instinct, an involuntary professional reflex that drew my eye to the labels. One file, sitting squarely in the center of the desk as if awaiting review, bore a familiar name, typed in bold, black letters: Blackwood. For a heartbeat, I felt a sense of relief, assuming it was the file for my own case, ready for the meeting. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw that the file was open, and on the top sheet of paper, a document printed with the letterhead of that very firm, I saw two names. They were centered, joined by a single, elegant, and devastating symbol: an ampersand. Leo Blackwood and Amelia Blackwood. The air in my lungs turned to ice. It was not a will. It was not a trust. The document's title was clearly visible at the top of the page: Articles of Organization for B&A Holdings, LLC. My mind, the orderly, logical mind of an auditor, began to race, cross-referencing data points with sickening speed. The sudden coordinated surge of their attention, Leo's convenient legal expertise, Amelia's apple pies and feigned sympathy, their hushed conversations that would stop the moment I entered a room, the knowing glances they exchanged over my head. It had all been a performance, a meticulous, well-rehearsed audit of my vulnerabilities. Every kindness was a calculated investment. Every expression of concern was a strategic maneuver. They weren't helping me protect my legacy. They were liquidating it. They were creating a corporate entity, a vehicle to absorb my assets once they had control. The humiliation washed over me in a cold, nauseating wave. It was not about the money. It was the chilling realization that to them, I was no longer a person. I was an asset to be managed, a problem to be solved, a doddering old fool to be flattered and manipulated until he signed his own financial death warrant. I placed a hand against the cool, smooth wood of the doorframe to steady myself, the city skyline blurring through a sudden film of tears. In that silent, sterile office, I finally understood the true nature of the accounting being done. I was the loss they were preparing to write off. The drive home was a fugue state, a journey through a landscape that had become suddenly alien. I have no memory of the elevator ride down from the 40th floor, of walking through the marble lobby, or of nodding to the doorman. My body performed these familiar actions on its own, a well-oiled machine operating independently of the chaos that had consumed the pilot. My first clear sensation was the feel of the worn leather of my car's steering wheel beneath my hands, my knuckles white and bloodless. I drove through the arteries of the city, surrounded by thousands of people, yet I had never felt more profoundly alone. The shock that had frozen me in that office hallway had begun to thaw, replaced by something that burned with a cold, clean flame. It was the righteous, calculating anger of an auditor who has just uncovered a deep and deliberate fraud at the very heart of the enterprise. Every red traffic light, every stop sign, felt like a personal affront, a delay in my retreat to the safety and silence of my home, where I could begin to properly assess the damage. My mind, freed from the task of navigation, began its own forensic audit of the past few months. Memories that had once been comforting and reassuring now presented themselves as damning evidence. Amelia's hand on my arm as she helped me from a chair was not a gesture of support. It was an assessment of my frailty. The apple pie was not a gift. It was a Trojan horse, a sweet offering designed to lull the city's gatekeeper into a state of complacent trust. Leo's earnest discussions about asset protection were not brotherly advice. They were reconnaissance missions, strategic probes to map out the territory he and his co-conspirator intended to seize. Each memory was a transaction I had logged incorrectly, posting kindness to the credit column when it should have been entered as a carefully disguised debit of deceit. They had not just plotted to steal my money. They had conspired to steal my life's narrative, to rewrite the final chapters with themselves as the beneficiaries, and me as a footnote of senility. The humiliation was a physical thing, a sour heat that rose from my stomach into my throat. They had looked at me, at Walter Blackwood, and seen nothing but an old man, a set of accounts waiting to be closed. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It felt like a crime scene. The familiar brick facade seemed to mock me, a silent witness to my foolishness. I walked through the door and was met with the cloying, sweet scent of cinnamon and baked apples. On the kitchen counter, covered neatly in plastic wrap, was the remainder of the pie Amelia had brought. I stared at it for a long moment. It was the primary evidence of their contempt, of the ease with which they thought I could be bought. With a slow, deliberate movement, I picked up the plate, walked to the trash can, and scraped the contents into the bin. I then rinsed the plate, washed it, and placed it carefully in the drying rack. It was a small, quiet act of rebellion, but it was a start. It was the first reversal of a fraudulent entry. I did not turn on any lights. I walked through the deepening afternoon shadows and sat down in Helen's armchair in the living room. The house grew dark around me, the familiar shapes of the furniture dissolving into monolithic silhouettes. I did not move. The shock had now fully receded, and the cold anger had solidified into something much more powerful: resolve. A confrontation was out of the question. That would be messy, emotional, a battle fought on their terms, with words that could be twisted and denied. It would, most importantly, shatter the world of my son, Michael. He saw Amelia as his loving wife, and Leo as his supportive uncle. To destroy that illusion would be a cruelty he did not deserve. No, my response would not be a noisy declaration of war. It would be a silent, meticulous, and final audit. I was an accountant. My entire life had been dedicated to the principle that everything must balance. The books they were trying to cook would be reconciled, not by shouting, but by the quiet, inexorable logic of numbers. I would not fight them for my legacy. I would simply move it. I would create new accounts they did not know existed, transfer assets through channels they could not trace, and build a new, stronger vault around everything Helen and I had worked for. My victory would not be the satisfaction of seeing the shock on their faces when I confronted them. It would be the quiet knowledge, months or years from now, when they finally moved to cash their ill-gotten check, that they would find the account had already been closed, the funds dispersed, the balance a perfect, impenetrable zero. Just then, my phone buzzed on the end table, its screen a sudden sharp rectangle of light in the gloom. It was a message from Leo. His name glowed with a new, sinister luminescence. The message was a masterpiece of feigned concern, asking if the lawyer had explained things clearly, apologizing again, and suggesting we all get together the next day to go over the plan. I picked up the phone, my hand steady. My thumbs, which often fumbled with the tiny screen, moved with a newfound precision. I typed a simple, short reply. "No problem. We can reschedule." I pressed send. The war had begun, and they had no idea they were already the enemy. The sun rose at its designated time the next morning, casting long, familiar shadows across the living room floor. Nothing in the world had changed, and yet everything was different. As I went through the motions of my morning ritual, making the coffee with the same precise 3 scoops of grounds, the actions felt imbued with a new purpose. Yesterday, this routine had been an act of remembrance, a way to cling to the fading ghost of my life with Helen. Today, it was the preparation of a soldier, a quiet fueling of the body and mind for the long campaign ahead. The house was no longer a mausoleum of memories I was tasked to curate. It was my headquarters, and I was no longer its passive, grieving keeper. I was its commander, and it was time to plan the defense. After I finished my coffee, I did not go to the living room or the workshop. Instead, I walked to the door that led to the basement. I descended the old wooden stairs, each step groaning under my weight, the air growing cooler and smelling of damp earth concrete, and decades of stored history. This was the foundation of the house, its literal and figurative core. In the far corner of the unfinished room, behind a stack of old paint cans and a canvas drop cloth, yellowed with age, sat my old metal safe. It was a heavy, olive-green behemoth from a bygone era, a relic of a time when security was measured in inches of solid steel, not in lines of code. I had not opened it in over a decade. It held nothing of monetary value that the banks did not already hold for me. It held something far more important, the tools of my trade, the very instruments of my former life. I knelt, the cold concrete biting into my old knees, and began to work the combination dial. My fingers, though stiff with age, remembered the sequence as if it were a prayer. 2 turns to the right, stopping on 42. A full turn to the left, past 42, and then stopping on 18. A final turn to the right, to 73. The numbers were not random. They were the year, month, and day I had become a certified public accountant. With the final turn, I heard the faint, satisfying thud of the last tumbler falling into place. I grasped the heavy steel handle and pulled. The door swung open with a deep, sonorous groan, releasing a breath of air that smelled of crisp, dry paper and cold steel. There, nestled in the dark interior, were my weapons. They were not guns or knives. They were my old accounting ledgers, great cloth-bound volumes, their dark green covers unadorned except for a small gold-embossed label on the spine. I lifted one out. It was heavy, substantial. I ran my hand over the cover, the textured fabric a familiar comfort. These books contained the true and accurate history of my life, a narrative told not in fickle words, but in the immutable language of numbers. Beside the ledgers lay my old Parker fountain pen, resting in its velvet-lined box. It was a gift from Helen on the day I opened my own practice. Its black resin body was cool and smooth to the touch, the gold nib gleaming dully in the dim light of the single bare bulb overhead. This pen had signed the documents that bought this house, that funded Michael's education, that built the foundation of our entire world. It was an instrument of creation and order. I took the ledgers, the pen, and a small glass bottle of black ink, its contents still dark and fluid. I carried these treasures upstairs as if they were sacred artifacts. I did not take them to my small, dusty office, but to the kitchen table. The same table where Amelia had presented her pie, the epicenter of their deception, would now become my war room. I cleared its surface and laid out my tools. I opened one of the great ledgers to its first, clean, empty page. The paper was thick, creamy, with pale blue lines so faint they were barely visible. It was a pristine field waiting for the truth to be sown. I uncapped my pen and, with a steady hand, filled its reservoir with ink from the bottle. The simple mechanical process, a quiet ceremony of preparation. Then, at the top of the page, I wrote a title in my neat, practiced script, a handwriting honed by decades of filling out financial statements. The W&H Blackwood Legacy Fund, I wrote. Statement of assets as of this date. The first stroke of the pen on the page was a declaration. I was no longer a grieving widower, a passive old man. I was Walter Blackwood, CPA. The audit had begun. I started with the most significant asset, the house. I wrote the address, the date of purchase, the original cost. But as I wrote, the numbers dissolved into memory. I saw Helen's face, luminous with joy, the day we signed the mortgage. I felt the phantom ache in my back from the weekend we laid the brick patio ourselves. This house was not just a market value, it was 48 years of laughter, tears, and life. Next, the savings accounts. I listed each one, the numbers representing not just dollars and cents, but decades of disciplined saving, of small sacrifices made for a larger goal. That family vacation we skipped, the new car I drove for 15 years, Every digit was a testament to our partnership and our shared vision for Michael's future. I worked slowly, meticulously, for hours. The sun moved across the sky, its light tracing a slow path across the kitchen floor. The only sound in the house was the rhythmic, gentle scratch of a gold nib on thick paper, a sound of order being restored, of a story being reclaimed, of a final, true accounting, just beginning. My silent action began on a Monday morning. The opening of the stock market served as my starting gun, the beginning of a clandestine war fought not on a battlefield, but on the invisible ledgers of the financial world. My life bifurcated into two distinct, parallel realities. In one, I was the character they expected me to be. Walter Blackwood, the grieving widower, a man whose sharp, analytical mind was slowly succumbing to the fog of age and loneliness. In the other, I was the man I had always been, the forensic accountant, the meticulous auditor, operating with cold clarity from the headquarters of my quiet kitchen. My survival, and the preservation of Helen's legacy, depended entirely on how well I could perform my role in the first reality, to provide cover for my critical work in the second. The first test of my performance came that following Sunday. Michael had invited me for dinner, a weekly ritual. I knew Leo and Amelia would be there. As I got dressed, I chose my clothes with the care of an actor selecting a costume. Not my usual pressed slacks and button-down shirt, but a slightly worn cardigan with a faint stain on the cuff that I had purposefully overlooked. I did not shave as closely as I normally would. I allowed my hair to be a little unkempt. Every detail was a brushstroke in the portrait of decline I was painting for them. At dinner, I was a master of subtle incompetence. I fumbled with my fork, dropping it once with a clatter that drew sympathetic glances. I asked my grandson, Josh, the same question about his school project twice in the span of 15 minutes. During a conversation about politics, I appeared to lose my train of thought mid-sentence, trailing off into a confused silence. I watched them from behind my mask of benign senility. I saw the look that passed between Leo and Amelia when they thought I wasn't looking. It was a brief flicker of an expression, but it contained volumes, a mix of pity, impatience, and, most damningly, satisfaction. Their plan was working. Their patient investment in my decline was beginning to pay dividends. Amelia was particularly adept. She would lean in, her voice soft and condescending, and finish my sentences for me. She cut my roast beef into small, manageable pieces, as one would for a child. Every gesture was a public demonstration of her care and a private confirmation of their shared belief in my incompetence. I accepted it all with a placid, grateful smile. Their arrogance was the perfect camouflage. They were so confident in the fiction they had created that they would never think to look for the truth unfolding just beneath the surface. Back in the solitude of my home, the actor vanished, and the auditor emerged. My first move was to address my stock portfolio, the largest and most visible of my liquid assets. I could not simply sell everything at once. That would be a red flag. I called my broker, a man named David, whom I had worked with for nearly 30 years. I had to craft my words carefully. I spoke slowly, allowing a slight waver to enter my voice. I told him the market was making me nervous, that at my age, I was more concerned with capital preservation than with growth. I spoke of a desire to simplify things, to move the funds into something less volatile, perhaps a series of treasury bonds or a simple annuity. David, who had always known me as a sharp and decisive investor, was understandably surprised, but he attributed the change to my age and my recent bereavement. We spoke for 20 minutes, and I played my part perfectly. By the end of the call, I had initiated the sale of a significant block of shares in a way that seemed cautious and conservative, the logical move of a man winding down his affairs. The next step was to create a new, invisible destination for those funds. I did not use my desktop computer, which was old, and which Leo had helped me fix several times, a fact that now made my skin crawl. Instead, I used a new, cheap laptop I had bought for cash at a big box store 40 miles away. From my kitchen table, I researched small, highly rated credit unions in states where I had no connections: Oregon, Colorado, Vermont. I chose one, a modest but financially sound institution in rural Oregon. The process of opening the account online was anonymous, impersonal. I was just a name and a social security number, a ghost in their machine. I filled out the forms with meticulous care, creating a new, secret financial silo, a vault that existed completely off the map of my life that Leo and Amelia thought they knew so well. When the funds from the stock sale cleared, they were wired not to my local bank, but to this new, untraceable account. The first brick in my new fortress had been laid. I then began the painstaking process of consolidation. I unearthed old passbook savings accounts Helen and I had opened decades ago, dormant accounts with small but not insignificant balances. One by one, I visited obscure branches of different banks, places where no one would know my face, and closed them, collecting the funds in cashier's checks, which I then deposited into my new fortress. Every closed account was a bridge being destroyed, a trail being erased. I was a sapper, moving silently through my own financial landscape, carefully, methodically, diffusing the bomb they had placed under my life's work. One evening, deep in the meticulous process of my silent war, I hit a snag. I was trying to locate the original paperwork for a small portfolio of municipal bonds Helen and I had purchased more than 20 years ago. I knew the documents were in the house, but my search through the primary file cabinets had yielded nothing. My last resort was the old mahogany desk in my study, a room that had become more of a storage space than a place of work since my retirement. The desk was Helen's territory. While I managed the primary finances, she was the keeper of warranties, manuals, and the miscellany of a long life lived together. The air in the room was still, thick with the scent of old paper, and her faint, lingering scent of lavender. As I began to sort through the deep, cluttered drawers, I felt like an archaeologist excavating the ruins of a lost civilization. Each file I opened was a portal to the past. I found the faded, handwritten receipt for the sofa we were sitting on when Michael took his first steps. I discovered a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, letters I had written to her from a conference in Chicago 30 years ago. I found a child's drawing of our family, with a smiling son in the corner, signed in Josh's clumsy crayon scrawl from his kindergarten days. With each item, the cold analytical focus of the auditor softened, and the deep, aching grief of the widower resurfaced. I was not just searching for a document. I was sifting through the tangible evidence of our shared existence, and the weight of what I was fighting for settled on me with a renewed gravity. This wasn't about punishing Leo and Amelia's greed. It was about protecting this, all of this. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old appliance manuals, my fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound book. It was not the bond certificate I was looking for. The cover was soft and worn, the leather supple from years of use. I knew what it was immediately. It was Helen's gardening journal. She had kept it for the last decade of her life, meticulously documenting the triumphs and failures of her beloved garden. I lifted it out and sat down in the dusty armchair by the window, the journal feeling warm in my hands. I had not opened it since she passed. The thought had been too painful, but now it felt necessary. I opened it to a random page. Her handwriting, a graceful, looping cursive, filled the page with notes on the pH balance of the soil for her hydrangeas. Her words were like her, precise, patient, and full of a quiet, nurturing wisdom. I spent the next hour lost in her world. I read of her yearly battle with the Japanese beetles on her roses, of her pride in a bumper crop of summer tomatoes, of her plans for a stone pathway she wanted me to help her build. I could almost hear her voice in the prose, feel her gentle presence in the room. This was the woman they were trying to erase, the partner whose life's work they sought to claim as their own. My anger, which had been a cold, motivating force, began to feel insufficient, too brittle for the task at hand. Then I turned to one of the last entries. It was dated in late autumn, not long before she fell ill. The entry was not about a new planting, but about an old one. It was about the gnarled apple tree in our backyard. "The old tree is weakening," she wrote. "The last storm took another one of its branches. It doesn't produce as much as it used to, and Michael suggested we should probably take it down next year." I felt a familiar pang of sorrow, remembering that conversation, but the next lines changed everything. "He doesn't understand," she continued. "The new dwarf trees give more apples, but the fruit from this old one is the sweetest. It has the best flavor. It has earned its place in the sun. I told Walter we need to support the main branch this winter. We must not let it fall." I closed the journal, my fingers pressing into the soft leather cover. A profound, piercing clarity washed over me, so powerful it felt like a physical shock. Her words were not just about a tree. They were a message, a final directive sent across the silent gulf of time. I was the old tree, gnarled, weakened by the storms of grief and age, no longer as productive as I once was. To others, like Michael, and certainly to Leo and Amelia, I was a thing whose time had passed, a candidate for removal to make way for something new. But Helen, my Helen, had seen the value in the old tree. She knew that the fruit it bore, the legacy, the security, the accumulated sweetness of a lifetime, was of a quality that could not be replicated. Her final instruction, the last task she ever recorded, was to support the old tree, to not let it fall. In that quiet, dusty room, my mission was transformed. The cold, brittle anger of a wronged man dissolved, and in its place, something far stronger began to form. It was a resolve as deep and patient as the roots of the tree itself. This was no longer about revenge. Revenge was a barren act, an accountant's angry red line through a fraudulent entry. This was about preservation. It was about nurturing. It was an act of love. I was no longer fighting against them. I was fighting for her memory, for her values, for her final, written wish. I stood up, placed the journal carefully back in the drawer, and closed it. The search for the bond certificate no longer seemed important. I had found what I was truly looking for, a purpose as solid and unshakable as the granite bedrock beneath our home. Armed with the quiet mandate from Helen's journal, my mission had evolved. I was no longer just a man trying to protect his assets. I was the sworn guardian of a legacy, a living trust of memory and love. This new clarity sharpened my focus. My silent war required more than just clandestine financial maneuvers. It required intelligence. I needed to understand the enemy, to study their methods, to gauge the depth of their arrogance. The following weekend, I was given the perfect opportunity. Michael's home, the stage for our weekly family dinners, became my observation post. I was no longer a passive guest, but an anthropologist in the field, observing the tribe, documenting their rituals, and waiting for them to reveal the tells that would betray their true natures. Michael's house was a world away from my own. It was loud, bright, and full of the vibrant, chaotic energy of a young family. Toys were scattered across the floor, the television was always on, and the air smelled of laundry detergent and whatever my grandson Josh had been microwaving. It was a place of forward-moving life, so different from the still, backward-looking silence of my own home. I often felt like a visitor from another era when I was there, and I now used that feeling to my advantage, wrapping it around myself like an invisibility cloak. I was the old man in the corner, a piece of living furniture that could be safely ignored. And from that vantage point, I watched. I watched Amelia play the role of the perfect wife and mother. She orchestrated the dinner with a frantic, theatrical efficiency, moving between the kitchen and the dining room, her voice a constant, cheerful hum. She doted on Michael, laughing at his jokes a little too loudly, touching his arm a little too often. She was attentive to Josh, helping him with his homework, her head bent close to his. To the casual observer, she was the flawless centerpiece of a happy family. But my auditor's eye, trained to spot the subtle discrepancy, saw the truth beneath the performance. I saw the way her smile never truly settled in her eyes when she looked at my son. It was a mask she wore, well-rehearsed and convincing, but a mask nonetheless. And I saw, with chilling clarity, where the genuine smiles were directed. Leo arrived, as always, with a bottle of expensive wine and a booming laugh that filled the house. He was the jovial uncle, the supportive brother. He embraced Michael, clapped him on the back, and immediately engaged him in a conversation about business, positioning himself as a mentor, a peer. But I saw the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, not with the warmth of a guest, but with the cool, appraising gaze of a man taking inventory. He was assessing the value of Michael's life, not its happiness. He and Amelia were a perfectly synchronized team. Their movements were a subtle ballet of deception. In the kitchen, as she was pulling the roast from the oven, he came up behind her to get a glass from the cupboard. For a single, unguarded moment, as he passed, the back of his hand brushed against hers. It was not an accidental touch. It was deliberate, intimate, a fleeting gesture of possession that spoke a truth louder than any words. They were partners, in every sense of the word. Later, while sitting in the living room, I pretended to doze off in my armchair, my head tilted slightly to the side. The television droned on, providing the perfect cover of ambient noise. Through the screen of the sliding glass door, I could see them on the patio, standing by the grill. They thought I was asleep. Their voices were low, but the evening was still, and the words drifted in. I caught only fragments, but they were enough. "Just a little more patience," Leo murmured. Amelia's reply was sharp. "The paperwork is taking too long." And then the phrase from Leo that landed like a punch. "He's ready. He'll sign anything we put in front of him now. The trust is absolute." The trust is absolute. They were speaking of my trust in them, the very trust they were meticulously planning to betray. They were discussing me as if I were a line item, a final detail in their business plan. It was then that I decided to test the depth of their condescension, to give their arrogance one more final push. I stirred, blinking my eyes as if waking from a deep sleep. I picked up the tablet computer Josh had left on the end table. I stared at it with a look of profound confusion. "Leo," I called out, my voice thin and reedy. "Could you help your old uncle with this contraption? I can't seem to find the internet button." The lie was so blatant, so absurd, that it had to be believable. Leo came inside, a long-suffering sigh barely concealed. He took the tablet from my hands with an exaggerated gentleness. "It's an app, Walt," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of patronizing patience one uses with a very small child. "You just tap the icon. See?" He demonstrated the simple action as if he were revealing one of the great secrets of the universe. I watched his face, the smug certainty in his eyes, the faint smirk on his lips. He was so utterly convinced of my decline, so confident in his own superiority. It was the most crucial miscalculation of his life. He and Amelia saw an old, failing man. They had no idea they were looking at the auditor who had just received their final, signed confession. The drive home from Michael's house was different from the one I had taken from the lawyer's office weeks before. The shock and humiliation had been replaced by a cold, diamond-hard certainty. Their words, "The trust is absolute," echoed in my mind, not as an insult, but as a profound, albeit unintentional truth. They were right. The trust was absolute. Not my misplaced trust in them, but the sacred, unspoken trust Helen had placed in me to be the guardian of our life's work. Their arrogance had not broken me. It had given me my mandate. Their condescension was not just an emotional injury. It was a tactical blind spot, a weakness I now fully intended to exploit. That night, I did not sit in the dark. I returned to my headquarters at the kitchen table, switched on the lamp, and transitioned my operation from defense to offense. The initial phase of securing my assets had been about retreat and concealment. Now, it was time to design and build the fortress. My work for the next several days was a deep dive into the world I knew best, a world of research, structure, and binding rules. My new untraceable laptop became my gateway to archives of legal and financial knowledge. I, who had spent a lifetime advising clients on the fiscal soundness of their plans, now became my own, final client. My kitchen table was covered in printouts, my own handwritten notes, and thick, dusty financial planning books I retrieved from my study. I analyzed my options with the dispassionate scrutiny of an auditor examining a prospectus. A simple will was too easily contested. They could produce witnesses, doctors, to testify to my supposed mental decline, painting a picture of an old man manipulated by some outside influence. A simple transfer of assets to Michael was equally flawed, a fact that settled in my heart with the weight of a stone. This was the most painful calculation I had to make. The weak point in my fortress, the single vulnerability that could lead to its collapse, was my own son. Not through malice, but through love. Michael was a good man, with a good heart. He loved his wife. He trusted his uncle. I knew, with the certainty of a father, that after I was gone, they would work on him. They would use his grief as a lever, plying him with emotional appeals, with convoluted legal arguments, with 1,000 daily pressures until he yielded. Giving him direct control of the legacy would be like handing the combination of the safe to the very people trying to crack it. His goodness was a liability I could not afford. The pain of this realization was sharp, but my resolve, forged in the memory of Helen's garden journal, did not waver. I had to protect Michael from them, and tragically, I had to protect the legacy from Michael's own trusting nature. It was in the early hours of a sleepless night, scrolling through dense articles on estate law, that I found my weapon. It was a legal instrument of profound power and permanence, the irrevocable trust. The word itself, irrevocable, was a fortress. Unlike a standard revocable trust, which could be altered or dissolved by its creator, an irrevocable trust was a separate, sovereign entity. Once created, once the assets were transferred into it, it could not be undone. Not by me, not by a court, not by anyone. It was a final, permanent act. It was the legal equivalent of pouring a concrete bridge foundation. Once it cured, it was part of the landscape forever. This was the structure I needed, a fortress that would stand long after I was gone, impervious to the emotional storms they would surely unleash. The genius of the plan, the masterstroke that would ensure their complete and utter defeat, came to me as I stared at a photograph of Josh on my mantelpiece. The trust would not be for Michael. It would be for my grandson. I began to sketch out the architecture of it on a fresh page in my ledger. The beneficiary would be Joshua Blackwood. The assets, all of them, the house, the contents of the secret Oregon bank account, the bonds, everything, would be placed within this impregnable trust. A corporate trustee, a neutral professional third party, like a bank's trust department, would be appointed to manage the capital. They would have a fiduciary duty to grow the assets and protect them on Josh's behalf. Michael would be named a co-trustee, but his role would be carefully and explicitly defined. He would be the guardian of Josh's welfare, empowered to draw funds for his education, his health care, and his well-being. He would also be granted a generous annual stipend for his own life, ensuring he and his family would always be comfortable, free from financial worry. But, and this was the master key to the entire structure, he would have absolutely no power to touch, transfer, or withdraw from the principal capital. The core of the legacy would be forever beyond his, and therefore Amelia's, reach. The trust would be mandated to release the full capital to Josh only when he reached a mature age, perhaps 35, an age when he would have the wisdom to manage it himself. As I wrote down the final details, a grim, quiet satisfaction settled over me. In the grand, fraudulent prospectus Leo and Amelia had designed for their future, they were the primary shareholders. In the new, legally binding reality I was creating, they did not even exist. Their names would not appear anywhere in the document. There was no need to explicitly exclude them. They would be rendered, with the stroke of my pen, completely and utterly irrelevant. Their meticulous planning, their manipulative performances, their entire conspiracy, all of it would be nullified by a structure they would never see coming. I looked at the finished outline, the blueprint for my victory. It was the most elegant, most perfectly balanced, and most important entry I had ever made. The books were about to be reconciled. All I needed now was an honest lawyer to certify the audit. The blueprint for my fortress was complete. A perfect, elegant design laid out in my own precise script within the pages of my ledger. But I was an accountant, a strategist. I was not a lawyer. I had designed the structure, but I could not build it myself. To turn my plan into an unbreakable legal reality, I needed an architect, an engineer who could translate my numbers and intentions into the dense, binding language of the law. This was the most dangerous step in my entire campaign. After the profound betrayal I had suffered, the very idea of placing my trust in another human being, especially a lawyer, felt like picking up a snake. But I had no choice. My silent, solitary war required an ally. The search itself had to be a covert operation. Using Leo's recommended lawyer, or anyone from that same world of slick downtown firms, was unthinkable. They were a club, a network of mutual interests, and I could not risk word of my activities getting back to my brother. My search began not in the phone book, but in the anonymous, sterile environment of a public library several towns over from my own. I sat at a public computer terminal, the institutional gray plastic cool beneath my hands, and began my research. I was not looking for prestige or a corner office with a panoramic view. I was looking for the opposite. I searched for small, independent practices in the working-class towns that ringed the city, places built of brick and grit, far from the influence of corporate law. I was searching for a fighter, not a figurehead. After days of careful vetting, reading through obscure websites and client reviews, one name stood out: Elizabeth Reed. Her practice was located in a small river town called New Hope, some 50 miles away. Her website was simple, professional, devoid of the usual self-aggrandizing photos and empty slogans. Instead, it featured a short, direct mission statement about protecting family legacies and providing tenacious advocacy for individuals against powerful interests. The word tenacious resonated with me. I found a handful of anonymous reviews online that described her as a bulldog, incredibly sharp and unflappable. She was exactly what I needed. The first contact was the highest hurdle. I could not call from my home phone. I assumed nothing was truly private anymore. I found a payphone, a rust-streaked relic from a forgotten age, at an old gas station on a lonely stretch of highway. As I stood there, feeding quarters into the slot, the receiver cold and heavy against my ear, I felt like a spy in a cheap novel. When her receptionist answered, I gave a pseudonym. "My name is Edward Stone," I said, my voice steady. "I need to schedule a consultation regarding a complex estate matter." An appointment was made for the following week. The drive to New Hope was a journey back in time. The glass towers of the city gave way to rolling hills, then to the old industrial town clinging to the curve of the river. Her office was not in a modern complex, but on the second floor of a beautifully preserved 19th-century brick building above a small independent bookstore. The very atmosphere of the place felt honest, grounded. I walked up a creaking wooden staircase and found her door, a simple wooden plaque bearing her name. The waiting room was small, clean, and quiet, with a window that looked out over the town's main street. It felt a world away from the soulless 40th floor conference room where my world had fallen apart. Elizabeth Reed was not what I had expected. She was a woman in her early 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair that was beginning to gray at the temples. She was dressed in a simple, practical suit, and her handshake was firm. There was a no-nonsense, formidable energy about her. She led me into her office, a room lined with books, not just law tomes, but history, philosophy, and literature. She did not engage in small talk. She simply sat behind her large, uncluttered oak desk, gestured for me to take a seat, and waited, her gaze direct and analytical. I did not begin with an emotional appeal. I approached this as I would a final audit presentation to a board of directors. I opened my briefcase and took out not a stack of disordered papers, but my green, cloth-bound ledger. I placed it on the desk between us and opened it to the page where my plan was outlined. "Ms. Reed," I began, my voice calm and even. "I am here because I have uncovered a significant and deliberate fraud being perpetrated against my estate. Before we discuss your potential role, I must first present my findings." For the next hour, I laid out the entire case. I spoke of Leo and Amelia, of their coordinated campaign of feigned concern, of the LLC I had discovered. I spoke without anger or self-pity, presenting only the facts. Then I walked her through my response, the secret liquidation of assets, the new accounts, and finally, the detailed blueprint for the irrevocable trust with my grandson as the beneficiary. I explained the logic behind every decision, the necessity of insulating my son, Michael, from both the assets and the influence of his wife and uncle. She listened without a single interruption. Her sharp eyes never left mine, and I could see her mind working, processing the legal and ethical dimensions of the situation. She was not just hearing my story, she was analyzing my strategy. When I finished, a long silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze still fixed on me. Then she leaned forward, placed her hands on her desk, and a very faint, very grim smile touched her lips. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice a low, steady instrument of pure confidence, "your brother and daughter-in-law have made a grave error in judgment. They mistook a lion for a lamb." She tapped a finger on my ledger. "This plan is not just sound. It's a work of art. It is clear, precise, and unassailable. I would be honored to help you build it." In that moment, the immense weight of my solitary war lifted. I had found my ally. The audit was complete. The construction was about to begin. The weeks that followed my first meeting with Elizabeth Reed were a period of intense, focused, and deeply secret collaboration. Our alliance was a silent partnership between two masters of their respective crafts. We communicated through encrypted emails, using a new anonymous account I had created, and occasional brief phone calls made from payphones. We met twice more in her quiet, book-lined office in New Hope, spreading documents and diagrams across her oak desk like generals planning a campaign. She was the architect, translating my strategic objectives into the dense, ironclad language of the law. I was the engineer, stress-testing every clause, examining every legal joint and stress point for the slightest sign of weakness. There was a profound mutual respect in our interactions. She never treated me with the condescending simplicity of a client to be managed. She treated me as a peer, a fellow professional with a deep understanding of the structure we were building. When she sent me the first draft of the irrevocable trust, it arrived in my anonymous email inbox as a heavily encrypted file. I printed it out, the thick stack of pages still warm from my printer, and sat down at my kitchen table. The document was a masterpiece of legal engineering, a dense, formidable text of more than 50 pages. I did not skim it. I read it as I would have read the annual report of a multi-billion-dollar corporation I was about to audit. I spent 2 full days with that document, my old Parker pen in hand. I read every word, every subsection, every footnote. I dissected the definitions. I traced the logic of the distribution clauses, and I analyzed the powers granted to the corporate trustee. I made notes in the margins, questioning a specific turn of phrase here, suggesting a stronger, more explicit prohibition there. This was the final balance sheet of my life, and I would not allow for a single ambiguity or rounding error. We ran drills, anticipating every possible line of attack Leo and Amelia might launch after I was gone. What if they claimed undue influence, that this new lawyer had manipulated a grieving, senile old man? Elizabeth had already built in the countermeasures. The trust document would be signed in conjunction with a notarized affidavit from my longtime physician, attesting to my soundness of mind and body on the day of the signing. What if they tried to contest the trust's validity on a technicality? The document was a labyrinth of legal fortifications, with clauses that disinherited any party who challenged its terms, and fail-safes that ensured its core purpose would survive any legal assault. It was, as she had promised, a work of art, a beautiful and terrible fortress of words. During this period of intense, secret activity, I had to continue my public performance. Leo called twice, his voice a slick veneer of concern over a steel core of impatience. He wanted to know when we could reschedule with his lawyer. I played my part, my voice weak and tired over the phone. I told him I had been feeling unwell, that the details were all so confusing to me, that I needed more time to rest. I could almost hear the satisfied smirk in his voice as he told me to take all the time I needed, to not worry my old head about a thing. Every lie I told him felt like another stone being laid in the wall of my fortress. He thought my inaction was a sign of my decline. In truth, it was the calm, deliberate silence of a master craftsman completing his most important work. The day of the signing arrived. It was a crisp, clear autumn morning. I dressed not in a suit, but in a simple, clean shirt and slacks. This was not a business meeting. It was a solemn, private act. The drive to New Hope felt different this time. I was not anxious or uncertain. A profound calm had settled over me. I was a man who had put his accounts in order and was now on his way to have the final report certified. When I arrived, Elizabeth greeted me with a simple, professional nod. The documents were laid out on her conference table, not the cold, reflective slab of my humiliation, but a warm, solid table of worn oak. There were 3 pristine copies, each a thick, heavy stack of paper. 2 witnesses were present, her senior paralegal and a quiet, older woman who worked as her bookkeeper. They were introduced. They smiled politely, and then they stood by, their presence a simple human verification of the act. Elizabeth walked me through the document one last time, summarizing the key provisions. Her voice was steady, even, devoid of any ceremony. This was work. This was the law. Then she pushed the first copy towards me and pointed to the signature line at the end. I uncapped my Parker pen, the same pen that had recorded the first inventory of my assets in my green ledger. I took a deep breath. This was it, the final entry. I wrote my name, Walter Blackwood, my hand as steady as it had ever been. My signature, once a tool for building a life, was now a tool for preserving it. I signed each copy, and then watched as the witnesses and the notary added their own names and official seals, their actions transforming my private intention into a public, unassailable fact. When the last seal was embossed onto the last page, a quiet finality settled in the room. It was done. The fortress was built. The legacy was secure. I had fulfilled my duty to Helen. I had supported the old tree. The work was finished. I shook Elizabeth's hand, a silent acknowledgement of her skill and my gratitude, and walked out into the bright autumn day. A man, finally, completely, at peace. The week following the signing was the quietest of my life. A profound and settled peace had taken root in the house, a stillness that was no longer heavy with grief but light with a sense of completion. The war was over. The fortress was built, the legacy secured. The enemy just didn't know it yet. I went about my daily routines, but the actions were no longer a defense against chaos. They were the simple, pleasant rhythms of a life whose final, most important task had been accomplished. I waited. I knew they would not delay for long. Their impatience, which I had overheard on Michael's patio, was my silent partner, ensuring the final act of this drama would arrive on schedule. I felt no anxiety, no fear. I felt only the calm, dispassionate focus of an auditor waiting for the subjects of his final report to arrive and hear the findings. They came on Sunday. The doorbell chimed at precisely 2 o'clock, their punctuality a testament to their eagerness. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. There they were, framed in the small circle of glass, Leo holding a handsome leather briefcase and wearing a smile of practiced benevolence, and Amelia holding a pie carrier, the domestic prop in their corporate theater. I took a deep, steadying breath, not of apprehension, but of preparation. I was stepping onto the stage for the final scene. I opened the door. Their performance began immediately. They bustled in, filling the quiet entryway with their false energy. Amelia swept past me into the kitchen, her voice a bright, cheerful melody as she spoke of the beautiful day and the apple cranberry pie she had baked just for me. Leo clapped me on the shoulder, his grip a little too firm, his expression a careful mask of avuncular affection. They treated me with the exaggerated, careful gentleness one reserves for a priceless, fragile antique that is about to be acquired. I played my part one last time, nodding slowly, my responses soft and a bit delayed, the perfect picture of a man who was no longer entirely present. I led them into the living room, my living room, which I now saw as the stage for this final reckoning. I sat in my armchair, and they took their positions on the sofa opposite me. Leo placed his briefcase on the coffee table between us. He leaned forward, his face a study in sincere concern. He spoke of how worried they had been, how they knew these legal matters could be so confusing, but that today was the day to put all those worries to rest. Amelia chimed in, her voice smooth as honey, saying how this would give us all peace of mind, knowing that Michael and Josh's future was secure. They spoke of my son, using his name as a key to unlock my trust, unaware that I had already changed all the locks. The dramatic irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. I simply listened, my face a placid, unreadable mask, and let them continue. I allowed them to build their entire, elaborate fiction in the air between us before I brought it all crashing down. Finally, the moment came. "Well, Walt," Leo said, his voice taking on a tone of gentle finality. "Let's get this sorted, shall we?" He snapped open the locks on his briefcase with a sound that seemed to echo in the silent room. He withdrew a thick document, bound in a handsome dark blue cover, the name of his prestigious law firm embossed in gold on the front. He laid it on the table with a quiet, proprietary thud. "This is it," he said, patting the cover. "Our lawyer did a fantastic job. This trust protects everything for Michael, with Amelia and me as co-executors to handle the difficult parts, so he won't have to be burdened." He opened it, showing me pages of dense, impenetrable text. He slid it across the table toward me, along with a heavy, expensive-looking pen. "Just a few signatures, and it's all taken care of." I did not look at the pen. I picked up their document, the product of all their whispered conspiracies and patient manipulations. I felt the weight of it in my hands, the sheer physical mass of their betrayal. I slowly leafed through a few pages, then closed the cover. I did not throw it down. I placed it neatly on the far corner of the table, an irrelevant artifact. Then I lifted my head and looked at them. I looked at Leo, then at Amelia, holding each of their gazes for a long, silent moment. In that look, I let the curtain fall. The mask of the feeble, confused old man dissolved, replaced by the cold, clear, assessing gaze of the auditor who has found the fraud and is about to present his findings. I reached into the drawer of the end table beside my chair. My hand did not tremble. I withdrew a simple, plain manila envelope. It contained a certified copy of the documents I had signed in Elizabeth Reed's office. I placed the envelope on the coffee table. It made almost no sound. I did not need to raise my voice. I spoke calmly, evenly, the words dropping into the silent room with the finality of stones into a deep well. "Thank you, Leo. Amelia. I appreciate you both going to all this trouble." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But it won't be necessary. I've already made my own arrangements." The change in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. Their smiles did not fade. They froze, becoming brittle, unnatural things. Confusion clouded their faces. Leo stared at the plain envelope as if it were a snake. Hesitantly, he reached out and opened it. He pulled out the top page, the cover sheet of the W&H Blackwood Legacy Fund. His eyes scanned the text, his confident expression crumbling in real time. I saw the exact moment he understood. His eyes widened, his jaw went slack. He saw the name of the corporate trustee. He saw the name of the sole beneficiary, Joshua Blackwood. Amelia, leaning over his shoulder, let out a tiny, almost inaudible gasp. I watched as the color drained from their faces, as the cascade of emotions, disbelief, followed by dawning, horrified comprehension, followed by a surge of pure, impotent rage, played out in their eyes. They looked up at me, their faces naked with the shock of their utter and complete defeat. I said nothing more. I did not have to. The document in Leo's trembling hand said everything. In the profound, ringing silence of my living room, I had my victory. The books were finally, perfectly, balanced. They left without a word. There was no shouting, no accusations, no final desperate appeal. There was only the stunned, hollow silence of their absolute defeat. Leo, his face a pale mask of disbelief and rage, simply stuffed my document back into its plain envelope, dropped it on the table as if it were burning his fingers, and walked out. Amelia followed him, her movements stiff and robotic, the apple cranberry pie still sitting on my kitchen counter, a forgotten sugary monument to her failed campaign. After the front door clicked shut, a silence descended upon the house that was different from any I had ever known. It was not the heavy, grief-laden silence that had followed Helen's passing, nor the tense, strategic silence of my secret war. This was a clean, expansive silence. It was the silence of a ledger that has been perfectly and finely balanced. I walked to the coffee table, picked up the handsome blue-bound document from their lawyer, and without opening it, I dropped it into the wastebasket. I did the same with the expensive pen they had intended for me to use to sign away my life's work. My final audit was complete. In the weeks that followed, their presence evaporated from my life like mist in the morning sun. The phone, which had once buzzed with Leo's patronizing check-ins, remained quiet. The weekly text messages from Amelia, once filled with photos of Josh and cloying expressions of affection, ceased. Their absence was a tangible thing. a lifting of an oppressive low-pressure system that I hadn't fully realized I was living under. The air in the house seemed lighter, cleaner. I could breathe again. The house was finally mine again, a sanctuary of memory, no longer a territory to be defended. The only remaining complication was Michael. He called me a few weeks later, his voice a familiar mix of love and confusion. He had not heard from Leo. Amelia was being distant and evasive. He wanted to know if I knew what was wrong, if I had perhaps said something to offend them. This was my final, most difficult task, to protect my son from a truth that would needlessly destroy him. I held the phone, the cold plastic pressed to my ear, and constructed the final, necessary lie of my quiet war. I told him that people sometimes grow apart, that business pressures can make men distant, that he shouldn't worry himself over it. I kept my voice calm and paternal, reassuring him that everything was fine. It was the heaviest burden I had to carry, the knowledge of the profound betrayal at the heart of his marriage, a secret I would now take to my grave. But in that moment, I knew it was also my final act of love as a father, shielding my son not from a financial threat, but from a devastating heartbreak. I carried the truth so that he could continue to live in peace. My life settled into a new rhythm, a peaceful coda to a turbulent movement. I would wake with the sun, make my coffee, and sit in Helen's armchair. But I no longer felt like a lonely curator in a museum. I felt like a man at home. I began working in the garden again, pulling the weeds from Helen's rose bushes, feeling the good, honest soil beneath my fingers. One afternoon, I found the plans for the stone pathway she had wanted to build, tucked inside her gardening journal. I spent the rest of the autumn laying that path myself, stone by stone, my old back aching, but my spirit content. It was a slow, methodical process, a final collaboration with my wife. On a cool Saturday in October, I went to watch Josh play in the last soccer game of his season. I sat on the cold aluminum bleachers, a thermos of coffee in my hands, and watched him run across the field, his face a blur of joyful exertion. I saw Michael and Amelia on the other side of the field. They did not see me. They were standing apart, a visible distance between them, and the easy warmth that had once characterized their public appearances was gone. Amelia was staring at her phone. Michael was watching his son, but his smile seemed strained. I felt a pang of sadness for him, but it was overshadowed by a deep, quiet certainty. The legacy was safe. The fruit of the old tree was protected, waiting for this young boy to grow wise enough to receive it. My victory was not in their unhappiness, but in his future. That evening, I sat in my quiet living room, the house dark except for the warm glow of a single lamp. My gaze fell upon the wedding portrait on the wall, the image of a young Walter and a vibrant Helen, their faces full of a future they could not possibly have imagined. I looked at her smiling eyes, and in the deep, peaceful silence of my home, I spoke to her without words. I told her the books were balanced, the accounts were reconciled, the final report was certified and filed away. The old tree, her old tree, was safe and supported. It would not fall. I had kept my promise. I had fulfilled my trust. A profound and final peace settled over me, a quiet, internal victory known only to me, and that was more than enough.